Hey, thank you for joining us for this UFF UCF podcast episode. I'm Robert Casanello, president of UFF UCF, and I am here talking virtually, remotely, with Larry Gerber, who is emeritus professor of history at Auburn University. And Larry, before we kind of get into this discussion of shared governance and faculty governances at colleges and universities, can you just introduce yourself to our audience?
Okay, well, as you said, Larry Gerber is my name. I have a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. And after having various jobs, I ended up at Auburn in 1983. When I first arrived, I had no involvement, I had no knowledge really about faculty governance or university politics, having had a number of temporary jobs over several years. But soon after getting to Auburn, I became involved in the American Association of University Professors local chapter, eventually becoming president of the local chapter, then becoming president of the University Senate, and then becoming involved in the national AUP. First, as I was asked to be the chair of the AUP's National Governance Committee, and then ultimately became I served 3 terms as the first vice president of the National AUP. But the biggest involvement I had was over a period of 20 years, I was involved with the governance committee, either as chair, member, or consultant, until my retirement about almost a decade ago.
And of course, the reason I'm reaching out to you is because you're also author of the book, The Rise and Decline of Faculty Governance. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you felt that book was necessary to write?
Yes, I as a historian of modern America, that was my academic calling, and I'd written a couple of books in kind of standard history. But throughout my academic career, as meaningful as anything was my involvement in AUP and in university governance. And I thought, as I was reaching the time when I was going to retire, I thought it would be a great thing to combine all this involvement I personally have had with governance, both at Auburn and nationally, with my training as an historian. And I knew that although there is a standard history of academic freedom that well, actually, at this point is pretty old, but there was a major work that traced the evolution of academic freedom in the United States, in fact, a 2-volume work. There was no comparable work that focused on the issue of governance. And so I really didn't get going on it until I actually retired from teaching at Auburn, and then spent a few years writing the book. My main research resource was the AUP archives in Washington, which I made heavy use of. And I thought that, this would be as meaningful a contribution, both as an historian and as somebody concerned about the fate of governance, to plot out how shared governance had evolved, because it's a relatively recent development in the history of American higher education, and how increasingly, by the time I had retired, it was coming under a definite attack and was facing a number of threats. So I thought it was important to spell out why I thought shared governance was so important to the well-being of American higher education.
And I think you said it at the top of your response. There aren't many publications on shared governance and academic freedom from a historical perspective. So I'm going to urge everyone listening to this to seek out your book, get a copy, read a copy, keep it on your bookshelf for reference. Okay. One of the things that you alerted me to, and this was something that was new to me even as a historian, but was the idea that the threat or the fear of corporate influences on university governance and university education had been pervasive throughout the history of American higher education, dating back to the 19th century. Can you talk about that a little?
Well, I'd say in terms of history, it actually starts in the later 19th century, as opposed to if you go back to colonial times and Harvard and the foundation of American colleges, it was not an issue. But as the United States became more and more industrialized, and universities in particular became increasingly related to the scientific and technical development of the economy, and as businesses became more interested in higher education, um, corporations and corporate leaders began increasingly to take prominent roles in university governing boards. And so, as you can read editorials from the late 19th century about the dangers posed by, business taking over the American higher education system. They're not new. And there was actually not much in the way of shared governance even before business became and corporate interests became more and more interested in higher education. Before that, uh, colleges and universities faculty role was not so great until faculty became more and more professionalized, and it became a committed career, as opposed to the early stages of American higher education, when many people who were teaching in colleges, and to what extent there were universities before the 19th century, it wasn't always thought of as a career which required a PhD, and for many would involve research and more specialized training. That's certainly a 19th century development, especially the second half of the 19th century. And it was only as the professoriate became more professionalized, literally, that part of professional responsibility seemed to be gaining more control over what was taught and how it was taught, which led to increasing calls for faculty role in governance.
Mhm. So, and please correct me if I'm misrepresenting your research, but you kind of put sort of let's just say 1970 as the date. Before 1970, faculty governance functioned very differently from what we understand it today. So, how was faculty governance different? Before 1970, maybe even before the 1960s.
Well, there was trajectory. When you go back to the 19th century, faculty governance was on the sort of the upswing in terms of faculty involvement in university decision making, from especially the latter half of the 19th century. But then, especially, you can even date it. The AUP itself was founded in 1915 and marked sort of the first really organized calls for a more prominent role for faculty. But even then, most universities and colleges in America, you before the 1930s, had a somewhat limited role for faculty and governance. So, as I said, it's the greater professionalization and the spread of that professionalized faculty beyond a limited number of research universities that led to the increasing role for faculty. And so, really, I'd say the peak in faculty influence comes after the Second World War, when American colleges and universities, really were in the upswing, both in terms of their importance in the United States, but also in terms of their global reputation. So, what happens after the 1960s and into the early 1970s, I think a lot of it has to do with changing economic circumstances. In that, before, let's say, the early 1970s, when the economy began to experience some problems, that post-war period was one in which the United States was not only prosperous, but was just so globally dominant in terms of the economy. It was easy, to allow and everything looked right. Resources were expanding seemingly without limit. There were not a lot of pressures on governing boards or even legislators for public universities to be so concerned about economizing and applying more business-like models to the running of universities. But that begins to change, in the really, especially after 1973 or so, when the economy, it's not that we had horrible times, but it's no longer the kind of the open-ended prosperity that seemed to characterize the immediate post-war period. And that led legislators and governing boards to begin looking at expenditures and business practices and begin to think, well, we're going to have to apply a different concept of governance to our running of our colleges and universities.
And so is this where the Board of Trustees model came in, or did they kind of reform the Board of Trustees model to operate in this business-friendly climate that you're
I wouldn't
describing?
even say so much reform as, board members, taking on, a different attitude toward the conduct of their jobs. Because it's not so much that boards changed. And in fact, I forget exactly when the Association of Governing Boards was actually organized, but in the immediate post-war period, the Association of Governing Boards often worked in sort of coordination with the AAUP. And the most obvious product of that was the 1966 statement on college and university governance, which the AAUP, the AGB, and the American Council on Education jointly formulated, which recognized the basic principle of a faculty primary responsibility for academic matters in college and university governance. So, boards existed. They exist going all the way back to the founding of Harvard. So it's not so much that boards changed and even their technical role. I mean, before the Civil War, governing boards were involved in all kinds of stuff, even disciplining of students, so that they had power. But I'd say gradually in the 20th century, there was that period when the boards were sort of willing to go along with the notion that when it came to academic matters, faculty should exercise primary responsibility. But then when they began to feel these other pressures, that's sort of a starting point, not only with the growth of faculty unions who are also responding to difficult conditions, but to boards beginning to try to impose more control. And then I'm looking further ahead, and this looks further ahead to the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s. I think with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called end of the Cold War, there was a triumphalism about capitalism and markets, which kind of reinforced the notion that governing boards in the running of colleges and universities should fall in line with this notion that business, or the pursuit of efficiency through business policies, was the way to run universities. So that just sort of reinforced the change in the economic circumstances of the time.
So if we're looking today at university governance, what can we recognize in our experiences that are from these developments since 1970 that you just mentioned?
Well, I mean, certainly, with the current situation with the pandemic, but how much this has actually been borne out in fact. But the obvious fear when the pandemic began and enrollments, turned down, and especially for smaller institutions, the fear that the economic situation was going to be dire and that cuts would need to be made. I mean, this is, I think there's, because of some actions taken by the federal government, I think the situation probably hasn't been as bad as was foreseen, a year and a half ago or a year and a half ago. But that, I think, has put tremendous pressure on the notion of shared governance when governing boards or state legislators are thinking, boy, in these hard times, we have a lot of decisions to make where we can't, turn to faculty. We got to make other decisions that are based on the so-called bottom line. So it's only reinforced the situation.
So I know locally here at UCF, and I'm, I understand you probably didn't know much about UCF before I reached out to you, but I know on several occasions, just in my capacity as union president, I have witnessed and heard very public statements to the effect that, these decisions, whether they be COVID related decisions about classroom modality, or even the ways in which different uh, organizations and institutions on campus that are here for faculty are run. I keep hearing from upper administration that faculty opinion and, faculty feedback have no bearing on any decisions made concerning these offices. And, just from reading your book and what I'm learning, I'm thinking this is exactly how it's supposed to function. And, in 2021, is this where we are today,
Yeah,
since
well,
1920?
I mean, the notion that faculty shouldn't be involved in determining the ways in which teaching is conducted is just, it's almost mind blowing. I think the bottom line, and since you read my book, I mean, the what I well, I have to confess, I certainly believed this before I started writing the book, but writing the book only reinforced the belief that the quality of American higher education uh, is directly related to the growth of faculty voice in the way in which teaching and research are conducted and the way universities are run. That you get a more and more professionalized faculty, it's just like with other professions, you would expect that people with the expertise should be responsible with oversight. I mean, that's governing boards certainly have a role in oversight, but that when it comes to making, basic decisions about teaching and research and the way in which the academic side of universities is run, that it's the faculty who have the greatest expertise and should be relied upon to have what the AUP refers to as primary responsibility for those academic decisions. And I certainly fear that we keep going down this road of taking away from the faculty the right to have primary responsibility for academic decisions, that eventually that the quality of American higher education is going to deteriorate, because I don't think you're going to have high quality when the only thing you're worrying about is sort of a cost benefit analysis where only the dollars are considered. I mean, shouldn't we just sort of get rid of philosophy, get rid of a whole bunch of areas of study which don't produce any monetary benefits? And I think that would be horrendous for the well-being of the whole society. But that is certainly a threat that we're facing today.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Gerber, for joining me today. And in the notes for this podcast, I will make sure I will link not only to your book but to many of the articles and interviews I found with you online. I know you've shared your thoughts over the years, and I found it all very enlightening.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate it.